So, welcome to another episode of Raising the Bar with myself, John Cooper, and today I have a very special guest. I have Stephen Hicks. Stephen is Professor of Philosophy at Rockford University, Illinois, Executive Director of the Center for Ethics and Entrepreneurship, and Senior Scholar at the Atlas Society. Stephen has a PhD in Philosophy from Indiana University, Bloomington. He's the author of numerous articles and essays and has published 5 books which have been translated into 16 languages. We're going to be talking with Stephen about his brilliant book, Explaining Postmodernism, Skepticism and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault, originally published in 2004, and his websites are stephenhicks.org and ethicsandentrepreneurship.org. Stephen, welcome to the show.
A real pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
No, the honour's all ours. The pleasure's all ours. I'd just like to say thank you for writing this book because it tied a lot of strands together for me and also explained a lot of the politics that's going on, and also even things like the arguments that I have with family members and friends, you know.
Right.
But can I ask you, when you were writing this book, was there a bit of a difficulty in writing this book? Because it's called Explaining Postmodernism. Was there a difficulty in writing that from an objective point of view compared to wanting to write from, let's say, your own political beliefs and standpoints with that? Or is that just inevitable when you're writing a book that some of that is going to bleed into your, what you'd say, your objective analysis of the subject?
Right. Well, in a way, it's a hazard we all face as individuals. We want to understand the world. We want to understand ourselves, understand other people. And as you're pointing out, there are lots of philosophies out there. And one thing that we can easily do is just have our own sense and just lay that out there, not really try to communicate with the other person. So communication does require that objective move, and that is difficult. Partly it's difficult intellectually to think outside of your own framework and really get inside the head, that metaphor. But then also emotionally, it can be difficult because we have values, things that are important to us. And to set those aside and to think that maybe those are wrong, and empathetically, not necessarily with agreeing, see where the other person is coming from emotionally as well as intellectually, that is a challenge. But I would say that my home field of philosophy is a great value in this because it drills into you from the beginning the idea that all of these issues are complicated, many of them are very abstract, and there's been a huge number of extraordinarily brilliant people who have articulated well different philosophical perspectives, and you need to know most of them or all of them. So a lot of it then is years of training in how do I think like a Hegelian? How do I think like a Nietzschean? How do I think like a Platonist? And then, of course, sort out for yourself which element philosophical package. So when I came to the Postmodernism book, it was in large part alien, many of the arguments and the positions, and in many cases, the hostility that's built into postmodernism was quite off-putting. But at the same time, it was an interesting intellectual challenge for me to notice all of the strands, and there was an interesting puzzle how that movement had come together and was exerting the force that it was.
Yeah, I'd quite like to actually talk about the impact that the books had, and especially the hostility that you just mentioned, because of especially in today's society, it's very polarized, isn't it? And people are very sensitive to these things more so than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And I guess when you wrote the book, it was a lot more, less triggering back then than it is now, I suppose. So I'd like to get into that with you at some point. But I thought what would be great for the show is if you wouldn't mind. I know that you've actually done in your book, you had is in one of the opening pages, chart 1.1, defining pre-modernism and modernism, and you define postmodernism by contrasting it with modernism, and then you also bring in pre-modernism, so like the medieval pre-modernism period. Would it be okay if you could help us go through that? I know you talk about pre-modernism as mysticism and faith and realism and subject to God's will. Would you be able to just give us a raising the bar special of how we can see everything like a broad take on it from those various stages?
So we we live in the real world and we need to understand and engage with the real world if we're going to be successful in our lives. But then the question is, what is reality fundamentally? And the modern position has been to say, well, it's the natural world, it's physical, it's the world of cause and effect, and that's what we need to understand. And so we are naturalists in our orientation, and we use our senses, we use our reason, we do experiments, and then more formally, we do scientific method, especially on the complicated things, to figure out the truth about the way the world is. And that's broadly speaking the naturalist position. Now, it was revolutionary in the early modern world, a few centuries ago, against a more dominant intellectual framework that had said the natural world might be exist, but really it's a lower order. That the important thing is that there's a super or a superior to the natural world, and that's what's really real. That's what's really important, and it's non-physical, it's non-material, and we have to understand the natural world only as a derivative phenomenon from this higher world. And then if you ask, well, how do we come to know this higher world? And the argument there would be, well, there are some special individuals historically who had direct access or communication. They received signals or revelations or prophecies, and they then wrote them down, or they told them what those are. And those are the people who really know the nature of reality, these mystics or these prophets. But the rest of us who don't have those special supernatural connections, we have to accept what they say on faith. And so we follow the leader intellectually, or we follow the institutions, or we follow the books in which those are recorded. Now that debate between, and this is at a high level of abstraction, a pre-modern, more mystical, supernaturalistic philosophy and a more naturalistic, empirical, rational, science-friendly philosophy is deep. And that's what I'm calling pre-modernism versus modernism. Now, postmodernism is another thing altogether. It is a thoroughgoing skepticism, in effect, of saying, a plague on both of your houses, because from their perspective, what they're thinking is both the pre-modernists or religious people and scientific people think that they know what the truth is, that they know what reality is, and they've got these special methods to figure out what the truth is. But the postmoderns buy into all of the skeptical arguments that have been developed to say that we really don't know anything. Everything is illusion. Our minds are subject to all sorts of biases and preconceptions and conditioning or whatever it is, such that we really shouldn't even be talking about what reality is. We just have these subjective beliefs or these subjective creations, and sometimes they are socially constructed. So nobody really knows what the truth is or what reality is. And so we should just stop using those words. Now that's one set of fundamental issues. Now another set of issues is not just knowing reality, but knowing ourselves. Who am I? If I'm going to put together a flourishing life, the best life I can possibly live for myself, what goals should I set for myself that are both realistic and idealistic and legitimate, and then dedicate myself to those. So I have to understand what my humanity is, what my capacities are, and what's really good in the world. And what, again, we find at a high level of abstraction is this three-way debate. So the Moss will say, you are an individual, you have your own life to live, you have your own character to shape, you have your own dreams to pursue, and socially we should give people lots of freedom so that they can go out and do those sorts of things. And so that individualism, that dream big and have lots of freedom framework came out of modern philosophy. And most of us in the Western world and increasingly in the global world are coming from that perspective, so to speak. But there's another deep position that, again, comes out of a pre-modern, more religious framework, which is to say that you're not really an individual with your own goals and your own dreams. Instead, you are a fragment, say, of the divine, or you were created by a supernatural being, a supreme being who owns you and has already told you what you are supposed to do. And your goal is to subject yourself to that higher being, to be a servant, and to sacrifice even your goals and your dreams for the agenda or the goals of this higher superior being. And of course, it may be that that higher superior being has his representatives on earth, and those are the ones to whom you should subject yourself and serve. So are you a servant, or do you have your own life to live? Are you an individual, or are you part of this larger supernatural or institutional whole? Should you be free to live your own lives and pursue your own dreams, or are you a subject, and what you should do is sacrifice and do your duty for the higher beings? And that's a very deep difference in understanding of what it is to be a human being and what your life is all about. But again, what the postmoderns will do is to say a plague on both of your houses, because one side is saying that you are an individual with your own agency and your own dreams. The other is to say you are a soul or a spirit that is a fragment of this divine spirit, and you have these objective obligations and duties that you are supposed to follow. But what the postmoderns will say is, look, there are no individuals, there are no divine souls, and instead what the human being is really this plastic thing that is born into a social reality, but we're all born into very different social realities, and we are constructed not by God with an agenda or by our own self-creation, but rather we are constructed by the societies and the various groups that we are born into. So you're born into an ethnic identity or a gender identity or a racial identity, but they're all so different, and they're also so contradictory to each other, but none of them is true or objective. So what you really should do is just see yourself as part of these overlapping groups that are contending with each other, sometimes violently.
Yeah, so it's competing social groups rather than the honouring of the individual, the sovereign individual itself.
Yes.
And I also, I mean, I've noticed that the word postmodernism itself gets bandied around quite a lot, and I've actually heard different definitions for this. I know Jordan Peterson talks about it as almost like a rebranding of what he says is neo-Marxism or cultural Marxism.
Right.
I've also heard this. I mean, you kind of, loosely inferred it there yourself. Kind of, it's identity politics. It's almost a little bit of that as well. I've heard it also connected to political correctness. I mean, is there?
All three of those you just mentioned are capturing elements of it.
Yeah.
Right. So the Jordan Peterson emphasizing of the neo-Marxist or cultural roots, that's to pick up more of the political strands of it.
Right.
The identity politics element is to pick more your human nature elements, not necessarily political, although it can be politicized, but what are you as a human being? What is your core identity? And then the other elements, I think, are the important skepticism, that's cognitive negativity about human beings. That's another important part of the element as well, or the package.
Yeah, and when you talk about postmodernists in the book, are you referring to the original philosophers, or are you speaking about the people that apply postmodernism in today's society and are therefore plugging in the political and the cultural elements? Or are you just referring to the pure philosophers at that point?
Well, in the book, as you mentioned, the book was published in 2004. So it's and I wrote it in the year 2000. So it's now 20 years. So we are into another generation.
Yeah, we are.
Yes, that's right. And what you do find in that other generation is that they, as skeptics, they're not interested in the theory and the history and the big principle ideology. They are activists.
Yeah.
And they what they are interested in doing is taking those principles and applying them. So, but I would say I'm interested in both. But in the book, primarily, I'm interested in the arguments, the intellectual history, how those arguments came to be developed and packaged together. But as you mentioned, yes, there are many elements in the package, because life is complicated, and so philosophy is going to be complicated. And so a big picture package, post-modernism, is to say we're going to take everything that modernism stands for, everything, and then go beyond that. Well, already you're going to be talking about 8 or 10 important elements. But then, as you're also suggesting here, it's not just a theoretical enterprise, it is an activist, applied enterprise. So an analogy would be, if you think about religion, religion does have people who are theologians, who are developing high-level interpretations and arguments for the religious position, but it also is going to have priests, and it's going to have preachers, and it's going to have social workers who take that religious vision and are not so interested in it as an intellectual system, but as applying it to their communities, applying it to their own lives. So the same thing is happening in postmodernism. So Michel Foucault and Richard Rorty and Jacques Derrida, those are the famous philosophical names, but now we are into a generation of activists.
And these activists, they're effectively, as you say, they're skeptics waging a war on the previous periods. Is it to the point of complete negation then, when it's almost just leading to nihilism, or do they offer any alternative or solution or points to move forward with this, or is it just completely disintegrating the house down to its down to its bare bones?
Yeah. I think there are some substrands of postmodernism. As with any intellectual movement, at a high level of abstraction, you put people into a similar grouping, but people are going to have different levels of commitment, different levels of understanding, and different levels of being willing to act on the basis of that. So, if you take the skepticism that you just mentioned, for example, there's a modest kind of skepticism that can say something like, well, nobody really knows the truth. We can't be rational. We shouldn't just have faith. And so all that really means is that I should be a little more modest in my claims. But for others, they will take the skepticism to heart and be very interested in undercutting anybody's possible claim to knowledge. And in many cases, it will be profoundly dispiriting to them. If I don't know anything important, then I become kind of emotionally depressed and think I don't even know what my life is going to be about. So what's the point of anything? But yes, in the movement, you will find people who are more interested in politics. What they will do is to say, look, I was born into a group, and my group has a certain value agenda, and I've come to believe that, and I feel that in my heart and hearts. But then I do some philosophy, and I realize nobody really knows anything. No group is better than any other group, but we're all in conflict with each other. And then, but their bottom line then is just to say, well, okay, I'm just not going to try to think about what's really true and what's really important in getting along with people. I'm just going to take my group's values and use any tactic to try to impose those on the world. And now that person has a value agenda and will become a political activist, but at the same time, they are skeptical intellectually, but they just don't worry about the intellectual stuff anymore. For others, though, they will then say, look, we have no agenda, and nobody's agenda is truer than anybody's, and I just hate the idea that some people think they have a lock on the truth and they know what human life is all about. And really what I'm interested in doing is just going through and puncturing everyone's balloons and undercutting any possible value agenda. And that can go in a nihilistic direction as well. Now, of course, there's another strand of people whom we know for whom the philosophy is not really primary. There are lots and lots of disturbed individuals out there who, for whatever personal reasons, they they hate themselves, they hate other people, they're filled with envy and resentment for who knows any number of things already in their lives. And what postmodernism does for them is gives them an intellectual veneer. It says, oh, okay, well, everybody really is a bastard. Everybody really is just projecting their conflictual value agendas on everybody else. And so it gives me a blank check and a kind of intellectual entitlement to letting out my rage and letting out my resentment on the world. And so for them, it's really a veneer over, an intellectual veneer over something that really has more personal psychological roots.
Yeah,
so there's lots of variations.
I was going to say there's lots of different tentacles coming out from the core philosophy itself. And I was actually just reading some of the reviews on your book, and one of the ones was that in itself. It was saying that there was a bit of a blurring of the lines between the strands and the kind of the application of the philosophy through these different means and different people's take on it. And then there's the actual core philosophy itself, which obviously you talk about in the book. And I think when people hear the term postmodernist, people often compare that to cultural Marxist, neo-Marxist, feminism as well, radical feminism. And I know in your book you mentioned in one of the opening pages that is it Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon? I think you refer to them as postmodernists.
Well, they have some postmodern elements in them. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, could you maybe help us show how that they're connected, the
Sure. Yeah.
postmodern, and their kind of radical feminism? Is there like a very distinct link there?
Right. Well, the same thing with, feminism is a big tent with a lot of substrands.
Yeah.
And so my use of Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon in that context as kind of drinking deeply at the postmodern well would be as follows. So what is it to be a woman? That would be then the core philosophical question, and perhaps psychological and biological question. And again, we can say there's, say, three positions: a pre-modern, modern, right, and so on. So the modernist position would be, say, well, women are individuals. They have their own bodies. They have their own minds. They have their own goals, their own dreams. And so they should be equally free as men are. And so they should have the same universal rights. And we have all of these histories of double standards with respect to women culturally and politically. So we should get rid of those double standards, and then all women are going to then be free to live their own lives, and their rights will be respected in society. So that's a kind of a modern liberal individualist feminism. Now, its main historical competitor there is a kind of pre-modern understanding of women, right? That women are have a certain place in the hierarchy. Everybody's under God, but then there's the church, and then there's the various feudal hierarchies, and then there's men, and then there's women. So women, again, are born subject. They're born into a role. They have certain duties, and what they should do is, in effect, give up their personal ambitions and do their duty to, and serve their place in the hierarchy. So you have that two-way debate that's going on. Now, the postmodern position then is going to be to say that both of those are wrong, right? We're not, or women as a group are not born into a place in a hierarchy and so subject, but neither are they free and autonomous individuals who have their own voices and own identities as individuals and should have freedoms in a more open society. Instead, what the postmoderns, and this is the postmodern element, was to say, women and men are both social constructs. There is no such thing as a reality here. And we can't say that we know what it is to be a woman or know what it is to be a man. Instead, all of these identities are a social construct that is put onto beings that are more indeterminate and plastic. And so we construct femininity and we construct masculinity. And the way that it has happened is, rather than saying everybody should be equally free and have equal rights, is to say that really these social constructs put men and women in an adversarial relationship with each other, that men have been constructed to want to dominate women, and women have been constructed in order to be passive and just accept whatever it is that men want to do. So that postmodernism is a third strand, a different kind of feminism, right, at this level of abstraction. Now, the connection then to Andrea Dworkin is that Andrea Dworkin quite explicitly, right, wants to say, all of this talk about freedom and equality and respecting women as individuals that the modern framework has talked about, all of that, and I'll use her kind of language, is bullshit. It's a cover up that men who have been constructed that they're supposed to dominate women, they will pretend that they are interested in women's rights and women's equality, but really what they want to do is basically, and this is again her language, is dominate, exploit, and rape women, and that's what it is really to be a man. And when Dworkin and McKinnon teamed up, as they did in the 1990s, in a more political activist form, they were arguing for a censorship of pornography. And the arguments that they developed for the censorship of pornography were precisely the postmodern arguments. It wasn't the old-fashioned argument that pornography is bad, the sexuality is dirty, and that we should suppress it and just use it for procreative purposes. It wasn't any of that. But also with respect to pornography, it wasn't the argument that, well, there's great erotica and there's nasty erotica, but we should trust individuals to exercise their own autonomy and free choice and to use it well in their own lives. The idea here was, and notice the postmodern language, pornography is a kind of language, and that the way the human mind works is that it is constructed by language. And so if we are born into a social world in which there are pornographic images out there, those shape our minds. And what they do is they teach men to think a certain way, they teach women to think a certain way, and we don't have autonomy or agency to make our own decisions about which of these sexuality messages we're going to accept or reject. Instead, we are passively created by these pornographic messages. And these pornographic messages uniformly, from their perspective, teach men to be exploitive rapists and dominators of women, and they teach women to be passive and just to take it. So as a matter then of policy, we have to just get rid entirely of that language, that pornographic language, and that requires a kind of censorship. So to that extent, they are using postmodern arguments to defend an anti-pornographic message.
I get that. Thank you. That was so well summarized there. It was brilliant.
Thank
because they it just sort of clicked in my mind. I had that real moment there as you're speaking, because I remember they were saying that you wrote in your book, they call for censorship of pornography on postmodern grounds, and I now understand it, because they were saying that it's because specifically because it violates women, not because it comes from a postmodernist thinking, but that's just the fundamentals that they come from. Almost they unknowingly are saying that because they see everything in terms of power differentials, power dynamics.
That's right.
Instead of women having agency, because there's plenty of these porn stars, they don't get into it because they're tied up and forced into the room, on a ball and chain. They're doing it because they want to do it. That's the agency that these women have. That's the modernist argument, right? But the postmodernist argument is to say that they're only doing this because they're subordinate to men, and when they see a man, having sex with this woman, it's because she has no say in that, she has no free will. That's how they see it, because they're seeing things through the lens of men are dominant and women are subordinate, I'm guessing.
Right, sure, that's right. And then, of course, they will respond to you by saying, those women you think who are voluntarily becoming porn actresses, they have been earlier constructed by society through methods that they're not even aware of to accept a certain role. So they have a false consciousness. So even if you have a woman who says, I like sex of a certain sort, and I like being filmed, and I like making a living doing this, well, you don't really know who you are. You've been constructed into that role. So you still are a victim.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's all making sense. All the conversations that I've had with everyone and the arguments I've had, it's because effectively, like I said it right at the beginning, they're coming philosophically from two different worlds. It's and they're projecting from their two different worlds. So of course, there's going to be these tension points, these points of conflict when it comes to basic behavior.
Yeah, to draw an analogy, the same thing will be, many of us will say, okay, being a porn star is maybe not my first choice of job, right? And I will do it if I have certain assets and I'm kind of desperate. So the analogy will be, taking a job at a fast food restaurant. Now, and then there's a difference between saying, well, that might not be your dream job, but you're nonetheless exercising agency in choosing to work in that fast food restaurant, and it still is a win-win transaction between you and your employers and you and the employees, versus those who will say you are forced into, by a cruel, dehumanizing economic system, accepting this dehumanized job. So you are a victim of the fast food corporation, you're a victim of the fast food society. And that's a very deep debate.
Yeah. Well, it is. It's because everything that happens to them, they are a victim of this totalitarian male power structure, patriarchy.
Yes.
And so there's almost like no way out of that, because they can always just pin the blame back onto the system itself. And actually, one thing that I've noticed, that there's almost people that come from that social constructionist worldview. I've noticed there's a kind of linguistic sleight of hand trick that they use, where they'll point to top CEO positions of companies, and they'll say, this is a male-dominated company. The top CEO positions are male-dominated, and what they actually mean is it's predominated. So it's the majority of. So that's predominated, but they'll use the word dominated because you can actually there's an equivocation of language there where they use the word dominated, but they'll use that so that people think subjugation of women. I don't know if you
Right.
noticed
Sure.
that. So,
Sure.
you know, you could equally say that females dominate men in primary school positions, but we don't take that to mean, you know, holding men back, you know, in terms of like
Right.
subjugation, do we? But I think there's a certain, they seem to be very good at using language and NLP, and I don't know if you've noticed
Right.
that, but that kind of, it paints in
Yes.
people's mind, the public's mind, that men are the evil, tyrannical overlords. And I don't know if you had any thought on that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, linguistics is absolutely, let's say, important, particularly for people who are activists, and for particular people who are intellectuals, because words are our business. But the more general point is, yes, every single important word in philosophy, politics, and culture is going to be used objectively by some and manipulated by others. In many cases, it's a matter of, we do have legitimate differences over what does fairness actually mean. We have a long-standing debate about what fairness properly is. But then also there are people who want to recognize that there are some words that have become success words and good words in a culture, but they want to subvert that word. And so they will use some conceptual sloppiness to get people to be less precise in that word, but then you can shift the meaning of that word over the course of a generation into something else. So, what is fairness? What is exploitation? What is liberty? What is equality? What is it to be a liberal, and so forth? All of these words are subject to the same thing that you're talking about. Domination is a perfectly good word. Power is a perfectly good word, but we need to talk about what facts give rise to these concepts, and come up with objective definitions of them, instead of just allowing a power struggle suit to happen to them.
It actually seems to me as though, and you could also refer this back to your original graph talking about the different philosophical stages, but this postmodernist era, it's as if it's completely anti-nature, anti-God, anti-life, trying to remove all the aspects that are intrinsic to, the natural world. So the distinction between biological sex, the genders, that's kind of being eroded. Natural hierarchy, so men will biologically tend to go to the edge. That's what the men do. They've naturally been the hunters. They've naturally protected the perimeter of the village, and that extends further to cities and the world. And they'll naturally, with their enhanced testosterone, rise to top positions of power, and also go to the very bottom positions of power. Some people, we had Warren Farrell on, and he talked about the glass cellar. So these tend to be biological expressions of the biological, but it seems to me that they're all being completely collapsed, because anything that's remotely connected to biology is seen as kind of an unfair, tyrannical structure imposed itself on the minorities, the ones that are seen as the victims of it all. Is that, and what's the end goal with it? I mean, and if we allow this to continue, what happens to society? There's a lot of questions there. Sorry.
No, absolutely. But yeah, as you point out, it's all interconnected. But notice in the 2-minute gloss that you just went through, there's a large number of biological claims that are being made there. And I would still say we are in the early days of biology. So a lot of that is going to be speculative, and a lot of it needs to be worked out. And then the connection between our biology and our psychology. And again, psychology is in its early days, so a lot of that still needs to be teased out. How those biological and psychological differences, both natural and acquired, play out socially in terms of social dynamics. How many of them are malleable? How many of them are merely just ensconced in traditions over the course of centuries and millennia? All of that sociology and anthropology needs to be worked out as well. So and also I would say that there is a huge cultural difference. So the evolutionary psychology arguments that you are making. So we say things like, and again, I'm just speaking hypothetically here, I'm a philosopher, not an evolutionary psychologist, but for tens of thousands of years, there was a rough and ready division of labor between the sexes, right? Men were primarily hunters and protectors and warriors, and women were homemakers and raising the children. And so as a result of that, There are partly biological differences that feed into that division of labor, but then there are a whole number of social and psychological differences that get built up upon that. How much of that changes by the time we get into the modern world? So now we say the people, the cutesy way of putting it is the people who are running the world now are the nerds. So it's not the brawny man who can run 20 miles, kill the woolly mammoth, strap 150 pounds of meat on his back and come back. And then the women swoon because he's the strong, powerful provider. To the extent that we have actualized our brain power and become scientists and technologists and engineers and able to figure out abstract patterns of rights protection and contract protection and intellectual property to create the modern world. So that's a very different social structure that is also part of our human nature, but it's over time going to lead to very different social and psychological dynamics and a different predominance of different types of human beings in the world. So I think all of that needs to be teased out. The only thing I would say is, at a philosophical level is, look, whatever male, female, psychological and biological differences there are, I think there are some, but it doesn't make a difference to morality or politics, or it shouldn't. Whether you are going to raise children primarily in your life, or be a real estate agent, or be an actor, or whatever your career is going to be, you still are going to need courage. And you are still going to need honesty. You're still going to need to use your mind to the best of your individual ability. And so those principles of being committed to rationality, productivity, and courage, those are true universally. And they are independent of detailings of differences between people along sex and gender lines and so forth. So, suppose we were to say, on average, males are 1.6 times as physically powerful as women. Now, I've just made that number up. What political difference does that make? Well, suppose you were able to prove that, Albert Einstein was 1.6 times as intelligent as I am. And, that you might be able to make an argument. What political difference is that going to make? And he's not going to get to vote 1.6 times and I get to vote once, right? Or he's going to have 1.6 times as many social privileges as I do because he's more intelligent. So the physical and the intellectual differences matter in some areas of life, but not at a level of moral and political abstraction. We have the same moral needs, the same moral commitments that we should be making, and we should have the same political rights.
Absolutely. Still keep the open playing field for everyone to make that decision and have their own agency and autonomy in their decisions and stuff like that. Absolutely. Yeah. I don't know if you actually answered directly there, but if postmodernism as a paradigm continues, is there actually an end game for it? And what do you envisage happening? Is there likely to be a sort of a synthesis that happens where you have you kind of, I don't know if you've heard the expression transcend and include. Yeah, I'm sure you have. But it's a spiral. It's connected to spiral dynamics. But do you think there's a likelihood that what will happen is it will kind of spiral back round, whereby you kind of go back into the old paradigms, and there's a sort of an integration of the two, and it kind of leads to a future paradigm. So in effect, because what I noticed was in your initial graph, you have like the pre-modernism. You talk about it's like the supranaturalism, and then it moves into naturalism. And then you have the epistemological side. You had mysticism and or faith moving into objectivism, and then of course you have postmodernism, which is about the subjective and the collective, whereas modernism is about the individual. Can you envisage a kind of a synthesis of the two, where it's the individual actually lies nested inside the collective in a sort of in a symbiosis rather than these kind of competing ideas?
Right. All right, that's another hugely complicated question, but nicely phrased. What's the end game for postmodernism? I'll start with that. I think this is too crude, but the broad divide is between postmoderns who are, I don't know if you've seen the movie The Fight Club or Fight Club.
Yes, I have, yeah.
So there are kinds of postmodernists for whom the end game is just to blow it all up. and
Yeah.
they really are nihilists in their personal life, and they want to extend that nihilism right more generally. And so just the opportunity to destroy, to smash windows, to see other people in pain and suffering, to tear it all down, that is one strain of postmodernism. There is another, I think, kind of postmodernism, and this is where the cultural Marxism, or broadly speaking, certain kinds of leftism, the value commitment is more important. So what they will do is say, our end game is to destabilize current society, because we think of ourselves as a beleaguered minority beaten up on by a predominantly corporate, modernist, scientific, technological, engineering-driven world. And we are opposed to all of that, but we can't just fight it face on. Right? Instead, what we want to do is destabilize it so that there is a kind of internal civil cultural war. And out of that war, we're not going to say that we are necessarily going to prevail, but at least we will have a fighting chance if we can destabilize things into competing groups, because those are the tactics that we are familiar with engaging in. So we want to bring about a civil war, not just for nihilistic purposes, but rather to level the fighting playing field. And then we think our group can prevail in that fight. Now, then the second part of your question is, how will all of this play out? Will it be a kind of synthesis or not? Now, here I think there's if you just look at 2,000 or 3,000 years of human history, the way it has worked out is that almost never does one philosophical perspective dominate exclusively. Instead, the fact really is that human beings are individuals, that we all have our own minds, and whatever kind of system we are born into, we all have the capacity of thinking about the prevailing norms, the prevailing laws, the prevailing cultural traditions, and so on, and to accept them or reject them. So what always happens is, even when one approach is becoming more dominant, is young people come along, and some of them are intelligent, some of them are more open-minded, and they ask the kinds of questions that human beings ask. And they are sometimes unsatisfied with the answers that their parents and their teachers give to them. And some of them are creative, and they come up with different ideas. And then it becomes a matter of, do they have enough cultural space in order to be able to articulate their ideas, attract a movement for themselves, and then change society in a certain direction. So in one sense, it's always going to be a matter of different individuals coming up with different ideas, and whoever has more power, but also whoever has better ideas and better charisma, society is going to be in an ongoing matter of flux and change. So we might say, for example, we have been arguing about religion for how long? Again, thousands of years, but there's not really one synthesis that's emerging. Instead, what we have is just dozens and dozens of religions, and each has dozens of substrands, and every generation we have the same debates and the same arguments, and just shifting predominances over time. So postmodernism is one more element in that mix. Now, the way I think it's going to play out is that we're in a somewhat dark moment right now culturally, but part of that darkness is that postmodernism has been working in an intellectual vacuum for the last generation or so. And so it's been able to build up a power base, and some important power bases: education, higher education, lower education. That's where teachers are trained. That's where the next generation of lawyers and historians and politicians and journalists are trained. And once they are trained, they go out into culture, and they then are in a position of influence. So what has happened in the last generation is they have gone out into culture, and they are now in their 30s and their 40s, and they are smart, well-trained people committed to activism. And the rest of us are now suddenly being aware of them. But what I think this means is the debate is being joined, not just intellectually, but also on all sorts of cultural fronts. And there's no way to predict who's going to prevail. But I think just knowing what the issues are and having more people aware that they do have a fight on their hands, that puts us in a better position rather than there being a vacuum and people being able to, by stealth, take over certain institutions. And I think once we have an open discussion and an open debate about all of these issues, the healthier ones, I think, will prevail. To a large extent in higher education, postmodernists are, they are an important force, but they are in, for the most part, intellectually weaker disciplines, the so-called academic ghettos. And then once the first-rate intellectuals at those institutions, who for the most part just want to be in their labs or just writing their books and not paying attention, but once they start realizing they have a fight on their hands in their institutions, they will do better, and they will reform the institutions. And of course, we're now in a position to build brand new institutions. We're extraordinarily wealthy, and we do have all of these amazing technological tools at our disposal right now. So if higher education, for example, goes into the sewer, well, we do have the resources to build new institutions of higher education pretty quickly, I think. Also, I always put a lot of confidence in young people, because young people coming up, no matter how bad their education is, there is something about human nature that we want to make something of our lives. Young people are ambitious. They recognize, even if they've had a very narrow education, that it's a big world out there. There's lots of possibilities, lots of ideas. And so they want to explore those. And they go through experimental phases. And so postmodernism, which I think is crap, it's intellectually well-supported crap, but young people, for the most part, are going to recognize it as crap, and they will reject it. And so they will go looking for other alternatives.
Thank you for that. That was brilliant. And actually, this podcast in itself is an expression of the, I don't want to use the word pushback, but just the intellectual, yeah, you could say intellectual pushing back on something. And I guess the more people sort of start to question things, there's going to be a natural organic movement, if you like, or new bubble, or new, philosophical ideas that are actually coming together to push back on the old. And then effectively that could be the synthesis, right?
Yeah, sure, that's right.
Yeah,
the ongoing winnowing will John Stuart Mill has the idea that the marketplace of ideas, and just like there's a marketplace for goods, marketplace for ideas, and as long as we can have free competition and debate and discussion, just as there's competition in a market, and also Democratic and Republican politicians, it's another marketplace of political ideas as well. And as long as we have lots of debates and free and open elections, I think we can prevail.
Yeah. Having some faith in humanity, basically, to sort this all out.
Yeah, that's right.
Brilliant. I've actually got some questions from the audience. I don't know if that's okay.
Let's go for it. Yeah.
Fantastic. In your book, you say modern thinkers, Bacon, Descartes, and Locke, start from nature and not from the supernatural. But Descartes, his quote here is, "Without God, all other knowledge is literally impossible. It is God, or at least the idea of God, that gives us the possibility of knowing anything with certainty." And Locke says, "We are all the servants of one sovereign master, sent into the world by his order to do his business. We are all property of him who made us, and he made us to last as long as he chooses, not as long as we choose." From my understanding from reading the book, it was that there was no supernatural element to the thinking behind those modern philosophers, but in actual fact, they did actually have some kind of basis, some kind of fundamentals grounded in the supernatural. Would you mind sort of unpacking that for us?
Right. Yeah. So Locke, Bacon, actually I put them in chronological order. Bacon, Descartes, and Locke, right? They are all early modern thinkers, and so they are transition figures. And the way transitions go is, if you're going to have a complete philosophical system, there's going to be, say, 50 issues on which you will have something to say. And it's not going to be that we go in one generation from people who have these 50 positions, and then in the next generation, all 50 of those have been rejected and they've been replaced by another 50. Instead, the way it goes is someone will, on one or two, make an innovation, and then the implications of that will be teased out over the course of the next generation or the next two generations. So someone like Descartes, for example, and the person is correct in quoting that he's a transition figure, and he believes in God, and he gives arguments for the existence of God. A similar thing would be said about John Locke as well. But the important thing about Descartes is, and what makes him a modern thinker, and why the textbooks say he's the father of modern philosophy, is the place of God in his philosophical system. So a pre-modern is going to say, we start with God. Our fundamental axiom is God exists, God created the world, and in the beginning, there is God, and we explain everything in terms of a derivation from God. What you find in Descartes, though, is to say that we don't get God at the beginning. What do we know first and foremost? We know ourselves. I know that I exist. Cogito ergo sum. The Latin is his axiom. And so he's starting from the self, and then on the basis of examining himself, he comes up with an argument for the existence of God that he then uses to undergird all sorts of other things that are in his philosophical system. But you'll notice that that's a big shift. Where do you start? Do you start with God, or do you start with yourself? And Descartes is saying you start with yourself. Now, a similar thing is going to be the case with John Locke. We don't start with God and explain everything in terms of the world. Instead, for Locke, as an empiricist, we use our senses to observe the natural world. And on the basis of that, we go on to form more abstract concepts. And one of those abstract concepts is the concept of God, but we have to give an argument based on nature for the existence of God. So again, you're starting with yourself, observing the natural world. God is coming later in the philosophical system. And that's an important transition. So that's why.
That's such a brilliant answer. That is such a fantastic answer. Yeah, it's as if God itself is nested inside reason rather than the other way around. I mean, that's just, maybe I'm wrong on that, but that's kind of how
our knowledge of God comes from our reason. So that means we have a prior confidence in the power of our cognitive faculties.
Okay. And then kind of linking onto that, would I be right in saying that you are making the claim that the medieval philosophers didn't value reason, or?
Well, no, and medieval is essentially a 1,000-year tradition. So there's lots of them, but again, there's going to be the place of reason in that system. So, do you think that first there are revelatory truths that have been captured by prophets and written in scripture, and that you accept those, and the role of reason then is to tidy up, or after the fact come up with justifications for those revelatory truths? That would be a pro-reason but still medieval position, because first you're starting with dogma, and then reason is in a supporting role with respect to that. And that's one broad school of medieval thinking. But of course, there's another school of medieval thinking that sees the role of reason and faith as antagonistic to each other. There are dogmatic truths that we have to accept on faith, but if we start to try to reason about them, even in this after the fact justification for them, we're just going to get snarled up in contradictions. And in fact, we're going to have all kinds of reasons to start to question and undermine the faith. So we should not be rational. So the broad division is between anti-rationalist medieval philosophers and reason in a secondary supportive role medieval philosophers. And what is going to make the moderns revolutionary is they're going to put reason first and subordinate faith, or set faith completely to the side.
Got you. So even if we looked at sort of like Aristotle, ancient Greek philosopher, are you saying that he is putting logic secondary to his belief in the supernatural, or would you still say that he's putting logic and reason to the forefront?
He's putting logic and reason to the forefront. So now we're going prior to the medieval world. So now we're medieval world, maybe around the 400s and on. So now we're going 700 years prior to that. So if we have to start talking about the Greeks, and I love talking about the Greeks, what we will find is all of the major philosophical alternatives are articulated by the Greeks. And I don't go this far back in the book, but there's wonderful stories to be told here. So the quick and dirty version would be to say that Aristotle really is closest to a modern naturalist, because he is saying We are, our senses work, they put us in contact with the world. On the basis of that, we form abstractions, we go on to do logic and so on. So he's a very modern, science-friendly sounding philosopher. Plato and the Platonists would be closer to a religion-friendly philosopher, because Plato wants to argue, the natural world is imperfect and lower and degenerate, and it's a higher, perfect world of forms that we need to somehow intuit. And ultimately, there's a kind of mysticism that Plato ends up in. And then the sophists would be closest to the postmoderns, the ones who are arguing everything is subjective, skeptical, and value power struggles. So
Gotcha.
Aristotle versus Plato versus the sophists is closest to modernists versus pre-modernists and postmoderns.
Got you. Okay, I'm gonna have to listen to that back as well just to digest that, because my brain's working on over
a whole other podcast just on the Greeks.
I know, yeah. But as someone said Aquinas stated that God's existence is not self-evident, and he gave his 5 arguments from motion, causation, degree, from final cause or ends. Does that mean that he is still using logic and reason secondary to his belief in the supernatural, or would you say that he's a transitioner, as you say, or someone that's an anomaly, or how would you kind of?
Yeah, that's great. I only have a footnote on Aquinas in the first chapter of the book. No, I think Aquinas is hugely important transition figure in the 1200s. Yeah, absolutely, for exactly the point that you are making. So what he's doing in effect is rejecting the Augustinian position that had been dominant for almost 800 years on exactly that point. So I think technically what Aquinas wants to argue is that faith and reason are two different but equally legitimate routes to the divine. But on that one room, he is opening space for reason to say, yeah, we don't start with faith in God, we start with arguments, and we develop those arguments for God, and God is a conclusion rather than an axiom.
They are very nuanced questions and answers, aren't they? Because these types of things, they can't be explained just through a black and white thinking. You have to really go into it and actually just unravel it thread by thread. And there's generally, it's 50 shades of grey, a very nuanced answer to it. And when you start talking about the transition period, it makes total sense, because there is going to be a residual breaking down of the old and then a coming in through the new. It just doesn't happen like a quick paradigm shift, like an explosion. It happens like a weaving in and out, doesn't it?
Yeah, and just if we have a couple more minutes, one indication of how long these transitions can play out institutionally is Aquinas is writing in the 1200s, but if you jump 400 years, 4 centuries, we then get to the generation of Galileo, and Galileo's great battles with the church. And one of the things that Galileo is doing is using Aquinas's argument to say that religion and science should not be in conflict with each other. Yes, we have these dogmatic truths that are captured in Scripture, and the job of theologians is to work out the proper interpretation of Scripture. But also, we have the senses, and we have mathematics and logic and scientific method. God gave us those intellectual tools to study the natural world and then to come to know him through his works, but again, indirectly. And so he's using exactly that Aquinas argument. Faith and reason are both equally legitimate expressions of truth, but the church 400 years later is still rejecting that element of Galileo's argument. And so he was suppressed, right, still for making the Aquinas argument.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense to me. Stephen, my IQ has gone up several notches in this last hour, and hopefully everyone else has had the same experience as me. I'm just blown away, especially your ability to make clear
thank you.
The parts where the blind spots in the understanding of all of this, because a lot of people, Jake, they take a snapshot of postmodernism, they take a snapshot of what people say it is, and then they get caught in the black and white thinking of that. And that can cause a lot of problems in itself. But when you actually dig into it and explain it and unravel it and unpack it like you have done, it really just opens it all up, and it makes a lot of sense. So that's a credit to yourself and the way you were able to articulate. And I'm hoping that everyone watching this is going to have exactly the same feeling that I've got from this. Just finally, Stephen, I'm going to mention your websites again, or is there anything else you'd like them to signpost to, or is there anything particularly that you're...
Well, you mentioned, yeah, my 5 books. I have a new book out this year, Liberalism, Pro and Con, looking at all of the major arguments for and against, but mostly the philosophical arguments that underscore our political debates. And then just recently finished a manuscript called 8 Philosophies of Education. Because of course, a lot of our battles is what should we be doing in higher education and in primary school education. And all of that is very philosophical. And with my co-author, a Canadian, Andrew Colgan, we just finished that manuscript. So thanks for the chance to give a plug. Keep an eye out for that.
Absolutely. Please check out Stephen Hicks's work. I mean, I'm blown away by it. Hopefully you guys are too as well. And I'll just say the websites again for everyone. It's stephenhicks.org, and it's also ethicsandentrepreneurship.org.
All right. Thanks a lot, John. Appreciate
Stephen,
the great
thank
questions.
you so much for this. And, you know, maybe if I can compile enough questions and, you know, we can get you back on to plug that when you launch, you know, your future book. So
right.
on that note, thanks so
Sounds
much,
good.
Stephen. Take care,
right.
and we'll speak to you soon. Cheers now. Right.